Your opinion required.
My name is Laura Morris. I have been a teacher in Loudoun County Public Schools for 5 years and a teacher for 10. This summer, I have struggled with the idea of returning to school, knowing that I'll be working yet again with a school division that, despite its shiny tech and flashy salary, promotes political ideologies that do not square with who I am as a believer in Christ. After reading about your lack of consideration for the growing population of concerned citizens in this division, clearly evidenced by this empty room tonight, where you shut the doors to the public, as well as the emails sent by the superintendent last year reminding me that a dissenting opinion is not allowed even to be spoken in my personal life, going so far as to send a form to my colleagues and I encouraging us to fill it out if we hear one another speaking against the controversial policies being promoted by this school board and adopted in this county. Not only that, but within the last year, I was told in one of my so-called equity trainings that white, Christian, able-bodied females currently have the power in our schools, and that, quote, "This has to change."
So that was a video of a teacher in Loudoun County in the United States. I believe she's a 5th grade teacher, so teaching ages around 10 and 11 in the United States. And she decided to use the forum there to announce her departure from that school as a teacher based on the requirement that her opinions and values, at least publicly and privately, change. And she didn't appreciate that too much, so she decided to step down. Now, this is actually quite an interesting topic, and I'm doing this live, so there might be a little bit of pausing and things like that in the audio commentary. But I just wanted to get this out there pretty quick, at least get the record down for the video evidence for posterity. So I thought we'd have a quick look at the definitions surrounding this and then go through some of the other stuff related to critical race theory. So initially I got the Collins definition up here, which is what I always knew racism to be, which is the belief that people of some races are inferior, and it's based around the group idea of immutable characteristics. So generally, you're feeling that you have a superiority over another group simply because they have something that they cannot change about themselves. Now, Merriam-Webster, they recently changed their definition, and this BBC News report, a student, Kennedy Mitchum, wrote to Merriam-Webster and suggested that in the wake of the Floyd death, that they modify the definition to include systemic. Now, I agree with this. Racism, like Marxism or feudalism, as economics and as a legal framework, etc., it's a system. So inherently, system should be in there. And the fact that it has been left out is probably an oversight. Most people don't necessarily look at racism as a ideological system, but it definitely is. So I agreed with this. And we'll have a look here. This is the new updated Merriam-Webster definition. It also is on the lines with the Collins definition, a belief that a race is fundamental determinant of human traits and capacities, that the racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. And then as we scroll down, we'll see here that a systemic oppression of racial group to the social, economical, and political advantage of another. And in the United States, as well as predominantly Western countries, you'll see this superiority, or at least the privilege, in favor of the white majority against the other coloured or indigenous non-white minorities. Now, Loudoun County have institutionalized critical race theory lessons. Now, this isn't necessarily teaching academic level, and what I mean by that is tertiary, so in colleges and universities, what critical race theory is, what its defining characteristics are. This is actually teaching the ideology to 10 and 11-year-olds, which is essentially shaping their outlook on life going forward. Now, if you are a young white boy or girl, you're basically being told that because you're white, you have privilege, which, whilst that in the main is probably the case, and you could break that down into its nuance, it's putting a pretty harsh light on that student from their peers who are not white. Now, take the example of a minority student, black, indigenous, doesn't matter whether you're in America or the UK or Australia or New Zealand, but those children are also taught that from the get-go, there's not much they can do, the system is against them, and ultimately, why bother trying? Now, this is very harmful for impressionable kids, as she outlined, and I'll go through what critical race theory discusses, or at least what it purports as to be the case. Now, this teacher stood on her values. Now, she was told that she couldn't hold her own private opinions by the superintendent of the school, which goes against any kind of freedom across the world. If you're not entitled to your own opinion and you're not able to freely express that in a rational and sane and peaceful manner, that is the definition of oppression. Now, we look at socialism and communism is basically you're not entitled to an opinion, and socialism is you're entitled to an opinion as long as it's ours. And democratic West, where freedoms are paramount, you should be entitled to your opinion, especially in the United States, where they are the only Western nation which actually has legal doctrine to state that you have freedom of speech across the board. Now, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, they do have freedom of expression. It doesn't extend to speech wholly. There are still laws against hate speech and things like that. However, when it comes to political speech, you are still covered there. So talking in a political manner, or at least if you're a politician, you can get away with a little bit more. So this is the article where the video originally came from. So this is from the Washington Examiner. It's pretty quick. The video explains most of it, and I'll put all the links in the description below so you can go and have a look. But basically, she had had enough. There was some other issues surrounding this, and I'll show you this article here. So in Virginia, school board meetings, yep. So Loudoun County, teacher quits. The big issue here is when the school boards decide to change curricula or impose certain constraints, the student body's parents are able to come in and discuss with the school board at designated times, meetings. Now, they were essentially barred from entering. Now, I understand that the room isn't going to be that big. Now, if you get 200 or 300 parents turn up, and the room can only hold 30, and with COVID and separation, social distancing and things like that, I understand why they would have kept the audience to a minimum. But it still seems like they're weaponizing COVID for their own agenda. Now, this channel is about your opinions. In this situation, this is my opinion. So everything that the school has done here, it reeks of similarities, not exactly, but similar to how oppressive societies have started in the past. Now, I'll let you go and look up those, predominantly in Europe, especially if you go back far enough. You'll look into Egypt, you can look into Greece, some of the Middle East, and certainly in Rome. The way that the governments or the authority figures use certain tactics to control populations. If you go back far enough, it's generally through religion. But here, it's just a different badge for the same kind of thing. So what is critical race theory? So critical race theory was a thought process and an analysis that was started in the 70s, got some legs in the 80s, and was formulated or became formal towards the end of the 80s, around about the same time as the Cold War ended. People were starting to, I guess, look at different avenues of study and ways to employ their brain. But ultimately, critical race theory, and I'll show you another article here where it's in this one, where it outlines the 6 basic tenets. Now, these came out in 2001, so it's a little bit later. So it's had about a decade to mature. And I'll just go through these. So the basic tenets, according to the legal scholars Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic, I guess. And it should be noted that critical race theory started as a legal study, which came from a separate legal study, which was called critical legal studies, and it evolved into critical race theory. And it was more about how the legal system and how the overarching principles of the legal system aren't going to necessarily detect the nuanced and systemic race issues that have crept in. So whilst it can identify those in-your-face, quite evident cases of prejudice or racism, it's going to miss those smaller cases. So the basic tenets: 1, race is socially constructed, not biological natural. Now, this can be argued, and I would definitely argue this. Clearly, there are defining characteristics based on where your heritage essentially existed. So if you're closer to the equator, you're likely to have darker skin than if you were further away. Things like that. So it is still biologically inherent that we can separate based on those identifiable characteristics. That is not inherently bad, and it is a good way to understand why people act a certain way, how cultures have developed. And in this situation, they're using it in a slightly different construct, and they're stating that it isn't biological, everybody's the same. Now, if you go and have a look at some studies, you'll be able to find that when you look at race and you see that there are differences in hair color, skin color, eye color, and the predominance of those different features, the differences within a particular group. So let's take, for example, whites and blacks as an individual group. So blacks as an individual group or whites as an individual group. The differences between the people within that group are far greater than the differences between the groups. So even though whites and blacks have different skin color and predominantly darker hair versus dark and lighter hair, etc., and maybe brown eyes versus blue and green eyes, the differences of whites between other whites are far more staggering, and the differences between blacks and other blacks within their own group are larger than the difference between a white and a black group as a whole. So that's interesting, and it basically states that race socially constructed. No, there are biological differences. Now, should we be prejudiced or should we discriminate on that? No, absolutely not. We should prejudice certain things, and we should be able to discriminate in certain situations. Clearest example is we discriminate who can go into certain bathrooms in public spaces, and I think that's fine. But where we're doing it on something that is an immutable characteristic, that's where we're getting essentially into racism. So the second point is racism in the United States is normal, not aberrational, and what they go on to explain that it is common, ordinary experience for most people of color. Now, this would be absolutely, I agree with this. This is the one point that I totally agree with. You will find this everywhere. You will find people will always have a innate reaction, big or small, and that obviously then changes to whether they, as that person, are a racist or not. In Australia, I definitely have this. I have a European last name, and I got a lot of weird looks and I guess Now, it's not immutable. I could change it, fair enough. So it's not necessarily racism, but I definitely felt discrimination when people heard my last name. And being a white guy who isn't, I'm not really big I'm tall, but I'm pretty skinny. So I was always looked at as being on drugs because of things I couldn't necessarily change. So I agree with this. This exists. I don't know what we do about it, but it definitely exists. So number 3, and I'll just scroll all the way down to 4. Owing to what critical race theory theorists call interest convergence or material determinism, legal advances or setbacks for people of color tend to serve the interests of dominant white groups. Thus, the racial hierarchy that characterizes American society may be unaffected or even reinforced by ostensible improvements in the legal status of oppressed or exploited people. I half agree with this. So, whilst I do think that there are some cultural issues within minority groups that, if shifted internally, if they shifted, would help them out a little bit more. I do think also that there are some not fat cats or cabal sitting at the top that are intentionally making things worse, although they probably exist. Where I agree with this is things like rent control. Now, democratic policy that came into the United States and severely hindered places like San Francisco, New York. Now, the idea behind it was sound. Let's get rents capped so that people who can't afford for a place to live are no longer homeless. Now, what that actually did was create more homelessness. And the way that it did that, you can find out more information from Thomas Sowell in his Basic Economics. He discusses this, which is, he's a black economics expert, I guess. You definitely would call him that. He's a bit of a celebrity. And what he basically described the outcome of that policy was, by capping the rent, the people who owned the properties, and you might have an apartment building that has 20 apartments, and they're now rent capped, they're not getting enough money to pay the super or to pay for repairs. The building falls into disrepair. The owner of the building then decides, okay, I can no longer pump my own money into this. I'm not making any money out of it. And they withdraw themselves from that market of equity for themselves. So now you've taken 20 properties and they're no longer livable because the building is essentially closed. Now, on the flip side to that, other places in New York, especially, and with the tech boom in San Francisco that generated more homelessness, was a lot of the executive types or wealthy people, and it didn't matter whether you were white, black, Asian, or whatever, who would work in the city but live in the suburbs, in the case of New York, would now find that there is an apartment available that is rent capped. So you take a little bit of a hit in your wage because you're paying for a second property. But when you are working late in the city, you don't have to travel all the way out into the suburbs to get home. You can just crash at the pad in the city. So now we have essentially overuse of this scarce resource by a single group or a single family. So instead of having 3 or 4 bedrooms for one family, you now have 8. Because one family is taking 2 properties because the rent has been capped. So anyway, that's one of the ways where it unknowingly hindered the minority groups who couldn't necessarily afford it. And it actually increased the rates of homelessness. Now, number 4, members of minority groups periodically undergo differential racialization or the attribution to them of varying sets of negative stereotypes, again depending on the needs of interests of whites. This is pretty vague. Without them actually going into further information here or detail, I'm just not going to touch this one. I don't agree with it. You should not categorize everybody and paint them with the same brush that a group of people within that minority group, what they cause or do. And what do I mean by that? So take Australia, bike gangs, Mexico, drug cartels, Chicago, black gangs. They're all of the races. I don't exactly know where in the United States the white supremacists are, but there are there. KKK, offshoot groups, and neo-Nazis. So that group of people, individual groups of people, all paint a bad picture if you look at them on race alone. The white supremacist, all whites are bad. The black gangs in Chicago, all blacks are going to shoot you with a gun and take your stuff or rob you or whatever. The drug cartels, all Mexicans are on drugs and trafficking drugs. The bikies in Australia, they're generally white. It's now pretty mixed, but all bikies are bad. Anybody riding a bike is going to try to kill you. So painting people with a negative stereotype, and this does come around. You can see that the news cycle on this is probably, like they say, every few years. It is periodic, and it comes back. There's a group of people, and then that paints everybody else with a negative light. I don't think that is actually part of critical race theory. I don't think that necessarily characterizes everybody like that, and I don't believe that this is actually true in terms of critical race theory and creating a situation where the rest of a particular group are now fundamentally disadvantaged because of the minority that are causing the problems. So number 5, according to the thesis of intersectionality and anti-essentialism, no individual can adequately be identified by membership in a single group. An African-American person, for example, may also identify as a woman, a lesbian, a feminist, a Christian, and so on. Look, identity politics, and that's what this is talking about, and intersectionality. Intersectionality is a label to try to put people who don't necessarily fit into a group into their own little group. It's preposterous. Unfortunately, the woke and the left, they like to group things. They like to put things into little buckets. Now, personally, I don't fall into a bucket. I'm pretty politically centrist. I'm for social policies like education. I think it should be free. Healthcare should be free. Your government should be able to tax and then provide for that, at least at a base level. But also, I do believe in freedom. I think if you want to buy property and get into that market, I think you should be able to. I don't think property should be be public and non-private. So I sit in the middle in a lot of things, and I'm happy to change my opinions if you give me some evidence. Sure, support it with emotion, but make sure there's some facts there. But this is basically a whole bunch of jargon. So this is saying because of intersectionality, no individual can be adequately identified. So therefore, why are people denigrated for being in a group when they actually belong to multiple groups? That's up to the individual. And you'll see that Candace Owens is an example. She is internally she's a feminist, but under the purest idea that equality across everybody, not women should be at the top necessarily. She's also black. But she's also a conservative. So that's where she sits. Now, do you have an intersectionality would say that there's a bucket of a black woman who's a feminist, who's a conservative, and you would put her in that bucket? Now, no. That just because that happens, A, don't put them in a bucket, and B, they're kind of going against their own principles here by saying, well, race can't necessarily exist if people live in other buckets, when it does, because you are that. Anyway, hopefully I explained that well enough, at least. And the last one here, the voice of colour thesis holds that people of colour are uniquely qualified to speak on behalf of other members of their group regarding the forms and effects of racism. The consensus has led to the growth of the legal storytelling movement, which argues that the self-expressed views of victims of racism and other forms of oppression provide essential insight into the nature of the legal system. Again, I'm 50-50 on this one. I think everybody's individual experience when it comes to race, prejudice, and discrimination is their own, and they are the authority to talk on that. Again, when they're with their peers of that same group, whether it's a minority or a majority, it doesn't matter, are the experts because they're the primary reference source. Now, the problem here is when you talk about a system, but then you talk about the unique qualified ability for people to speak on their behalf and those of their other groups, they're mutually exclusive. And I say that because the system isn't part of any one group and therefore can't have its own unique story. Where it does become a problem is where only one group are making the laws, which is what I believe this is arguing. And in that situation, it's hard for those groups to think, how would this affect the other group if they haven't actually been experiencing their same, reactions to other people, or other people's reactions to them when they enter a room or when they speak. Now, the way to get around that is you essentially increase the diversity within the lawmaking. Alternatively, you have people who, if you can't do that, the people who are making the laws should go out and get that other cultural experience and at least engage those communities so they're aware. And I believe that does happen. Maybe not across the board, but it certainly does where you have either black governors or white governors with black staff, and they get down and they talk to the people. Now, you'll find a pretty good outline of critical race theory if you want to go and look at it on Wikipedia. There are a ton of references at the bottom. I won't go through it. It's quite spread out, but also nuanced, and there is scholarly articles all the way through this which discuss the ins and outs. Now, it has evolved. So initially discussing the legal system, and then it's permeated through into other parts of society and looking at other systems. Now, why do I think critical race theory is bad? I don't think inherently the idea of critical race theory is bad. I think studying critical race theory as an ideology to adopt, I think that is bad. And I go back to what I said at the start. So when you are talking about shaping people's minds, this critical race theory leaves a lot of other things out. It only looks at certain parts of a bigger system, and it completely removes empathy. Now, if you look up what a psychopath is someone who's incapable largely of emotion, but primarily empathy, and they get through society by mimicking. Now, critical race theory completely removes that. So if you're looking at critical race theory to use as a way to view other people, you're essentially taking an ideology that lacks empathy, which would, by proxy, make it a bit psychopathic in its approach. But anyway, check out the Wikipedia. Like I said, it's got a lot of references at the bottom. I'll put the link. I mean, it's wiki. You can search for it. So why is it under attack? Now, I won't go through this article. I'll link it in the description. You can have a look. Ultimately, it's because people in the grade school system in America and in the high school system, and it's permeating through the universities, at least in the social sciences, aren't teaching about critical race theory. They're teaching critical race theory. They're teaching it as an ideology, and they're pushing it onto students. Now, I went to a Catholic school when I was in grade and high school. Now, they did teach Bible studies. They did teach you the Christian doctrine. They didn't ram it down my throat. And they did have a class called religious studies. Now, religious studies, and this is where I want to talk about that and the parallels with critical race theory, can be two things. It can be either pushing the doctrine onto the student to say this is how you should think, and it can be teaching you about religions. Now, in my case, it was the latter. And in my religious studies courses, which were mandatory because it was a religious school, we didn't actually learn in those classes. We didn't learn about Catholicism or Christianity. We learned about Judaism, we learned about Islam, and we learned about the parallels there. They didn't really touch on a lot of the Asian religions. They skirted around Buddhism a little bit, to show parallels to the Abrahamic faiths, and then they used that as a way to segue into how religion across the board has a lot of similarities in terms of, if you do bad, this will happen to you. If you do good, good things will come to you. There's generally a deity or a god that will punish you potentially, and that's what they did there. And it was more about the religions rather than pushing the concept of the religion onto you as a new way of thinking. That's what the problem is here. Critical race theory is being taught as a way to think, and it's being taught as a way to think to very young, impressionable people. And then when you get into university, where it's meant to be philosophical, it's being taught not as this is here, this is a way you can think should you choose to, here's the tenets, go and research it yourself. It's being taught as the way, and everything else is being taught in a negative light. Now, this has happened before, and after or World War II, we as a community across the world decided that this was not something that we necessarily wanted to be out in the mainstream. And I'm talking about Adolf Hitler and Mein Kampf. Now, it was banned for a long time. The Bavarians, I believe, had the copyright, and they basically said we're not going to allow anti-printing of it, rightfully so. Shortly after the copyright expired, which was in 2015, one of the Jewish societies basically stated, look, as we understand this will hurt people, we understand that the Jewish society is going to be fearful of this book and what it purports coming to the public forums, but they also understood that there is some educational value there of being able to say, hey, this is what this lunatic was thinking. This is how you can go down what seems maybe at the start to be, I think that might be a good start, to a very, very dangerous, nasty and bad end, where some almost 20 million people died. So it wasn't just the Jewish extermination, the 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. There were millions of Russians. Hitler just didn't like everybody that wasn't him and his group. And this, I guess this was a way to get back to the public, at least, 60, 70 years after the war. This is not what we should be doing. This is a good example of what we should stay away from. And this is how a starting point can end up on a very slippery slope, which is where critical race theory is at the moment. So I'll leave you with that. I don't want to go into Mein Kampf. I haven't read it. I don't care about it. I understand what Hitler was trying to do. I want to hear your thoughts on critical race theory, at least what you have experienced, what you think about it. And if your opinions differ to me, please put it down there, and I'll catch you next time.